The wind moved across the dry fields like an old memory, slow and heavy, carrying the dust of forgotten stories along the empty road that led into Willow Bend. It was the kind of small, American town where time didn't hurry and every wooden porch had a creak of its own. Folks there lived quiet lives, simple lives, the kind that rarely made headlines. But they all remembered the morning the lonely cowboy rode into town with a pocket nearly empty and a past no one really asked about. He wasn't the kind to talk much, and the townspeople respected that. He stayed to himself, did his work, and kept his eyes lowered when someone tried too hard to figure him out. People said he had the look of a man carrying something heavy in his heart, something he didn't want to share. That cowboy had been drifting from ranch to ranch for years, taking odd jobs, fixing fences, helping with cattle when needed. He never stayed long enough for anyone to say they truly knew him. He was polite, never rude, but there was a distance in him that felt like a closed door. The kind folks didn't push. Still, life in Willow Bend had a way of settling on a man, even if he wasn't looking for a place to belong. Maybe it was the slow rhythm of town life, or the way the evening light touched the barns and fields, giving everything a warm glow. Maybe it was the feeling that Willow Bend wasn't a place that judged a person for wanting a fresh start. One afternoon, while the sun hung low and warm in the sky, he walked toward the old livestock pen at the far edge of town. The place was worn down, boards faded by years of weather, metal rails rusted in places. A small group of ranchers had gathered for a routine sale, nothing fancy. Just a handful of animals nobody expected much from. The cowboy didn't plan to buy anything. He barely had enough money to feed himself some days. Still, something pulled him there, something he couldn't quite explain. Inside the pen stood a horse that looked older than most, with a limp that was hard to miss. Its coat had lost its shine, and the animal kept its head lowered as if trying not to be noticed. The ranchers shook their heads when they talked about it. They said the horse wasn't worth the trouble, wouldn't be of use on any ranch, and would probably end up being pushed from place to place until someone finally gave up on it. No one wanted to bid on a creature that couldn't work, couldn't run, and clearly carried the marks of a rough past. The cowboy watched from a distance. There was a quietness in the horse that felt familiar to him. Not fear exactly, but something close to it. A kind of tiredness that settled deep into the bones. He knew the look. He had lived with the same weight for years. Without thinking much about it, he stepped closer, stopping just outside the railing. The horse lifted its eyes toward him. They weren't bright or spirited like a young stallion. They were soft and worn, but there was still something alive in them. A faint spark that hadn't gone out. The auction moved along slowly until the old horse was brought forward. The man running the sale didn't bother with a long introduction. Everyone there already knew what they were looking at. He called out for bids, but no one raised a hand. The silence stretched on until it almost felt uncomfortable. The old horse shifted its weight, favoring its good leg, and let out a quiet breath that sounded almost like a sigh. The cowboy felt something twist inside him. He couldn't explain it. He didn't want to bring more burden into his life, yet his hand lifted before he even realized what he was doing. The ranchers turned to look at him, some with surprise, others with confusion. The man running the sale blinked, then cleared his throat. No one else bid. Why would they? The horse didn't have any value to them. The cowboy heard the final call, and with a single nod it was done, $1. That was all it took for him to take ownership of an animal everyone else had already given up on. The cowboy walked toward the horse slowly, speaking in a soft voice. He didn't reach for it right away. He knew better than to push his presence on an animal that had been mishandled or forgotten. The horse didn't step back. It stayed still, watching him. When he finally placed his hand gently against its neck, the horse didn't flinch. It felt like the start of an understanding, a quiet agreement between two spirits that had been worn down by life but weren't ready to quit. He led the horse out of the pen, taking his time, letting the animal feel the ground beneath its hooves. The ranchers whispered among themselves. Some wondered why he bothered. Others shrugged it off. To them, it was just another odd thing the lonely cowboy did. But one older rancher watched with a thoughtful expression. He didn't say a word. He simply nodded, as if he understood the choice better than most. The walk back to the cowboy's small rented shed took a while. The sun dipped lower, painting the fields gold. The horse moved slowly, but it followed him willingly. Every few steps, the cowboy glanced at the animal, noticing the marks, the scars, the signs of hardship. He wondered what kind of life it had lived before this moment. He wondered who had owned it, what it had seen, what had caused that deep, lingering sadness in its eyes. That evening he gave the horse a place to rest, fresh water, and a bit of feed. Nothing fancy, but enough to show care. The horse watched him the whole time, as if unsure whether to trust this new turn of fate. The cowboy didn't expect gratitude. He didn't expect anything at all. He simply did what felt right. As the night settled and the moon rose over the hills, a strange restlessness tugged at the horse. It shifted, lifted its head, ears turning as if listening to something far away. The cowboy noticed the change. Something about the horse's posture had sharpened. A quiet alertness awakened in it. Almost like it sensed something hidden, something buried beneath the calm surface of the night. The horse took a small step toward the open field, then another. Its nostrils flared as if catching a trace of something familiar. The cowboy followed its gaze into the darkness and felt a chill move up his spine. The horse's eyes reflected a mix of recognition and fear, the kind that didn't come from old age or pain. It came from memory. Something out there in the quiet land was calling to it. Something the horse had known long before it became broken and forgotten. And whatever it was, the horse wasn't just remembering it. It had found it again. What the horse had sensed out in the open fields would shake the entire town of Willow Bend. The cold breath of night wrapped around the cowboy as he stepped out into the open yard beside the small shed. The horse stood alert, ears pointed toward the dark fields as if trying to catch a sound no one else could hear. The air felt different. Still, but heavy, like the moment before a storm breaks. The cowboy didn't rush toward the horse. He quietly leaned against the wooden frame of the shed, watching, waiting, letting the animal show whatever it needed to show. The land around Willow Bend stretched far in all directions, a wide open plain bordered by distant hills and thick pine forests. It was peaceful most nights, with crickets buzzing and the faint whistle of wind passing through dry grass. Tonight, however, the fields carried a strange quietness. It wasn't the silence of calm, it was the silence of something hidden, something watching. The horse lifted its head even higher, muscles tightening along its neck. The cowboy had seen animals react to danger before, but this was different. This wasn't fear of coyotes or strangers. This was recognition. He moved a step closer and placed a steady hand on the horse's side. The animal trembled lightly beneath his touch, not from weakness but from instinct, as if some old memory had been stirred awake. The cowboy whispered a few calm words, hoping to ease whatever was troubling it. But the horse didn't take its eyes off the far stretch of land. It stayed fixed on a single direction, the same direction the cowboy had noticed earlier. Beyond the distant fence line lay a broken trail leading into a patch of woods. Folks in town didn't talk much about that place. Not because it was dangerous, but because it didn't have a reason to be talked about. It was just another part of Willow Bend where deer roamed and trees grew thick. But seeing the horse stare toward it made the cowboy think there was more to that land than he had ever realized. As the night deepened, he led the horse back inside the shed, giving it a small pile of hay. The animal ate slowly, stopping every few bites to listen again. The cowboy stayed by the open doorway, hands in his pockets, eyes drifting between the horse and the dark fields. He wasn't a man who believed in signs or strange calls from the night, but something about the horse's behavior made him uneasy. The next morning came with a pale sunrise washing over the fields. The cowboy barely slept, and the horse didn't rest much either. By the time the sun was fully up, he decided to walk the animal gently around the property. A bit of movement might help settle it. The limp was still noticeable, but the horse walked with more purpose than expected. It tugged slightly forward, always leaning toward the same far stretch of land. On his way back toward town, a couple of ranchers noticed him leading the new horse and waved from across the fence. He nodded in return, trying not to draw attention. Word traveled fast in Willow Bend, though. By the time he reached the small supply store, a few folks inside had already heard about the purchase. They asked why he bought a horse everyone else had passed on. He simply shrugged and said the animal deserved a chance. Most of them respected that answer. Some shook their heads lightly, thinking he had wasted his dollar. While he gathered a few supplies, the older rancher who had watched him at the auction walked in. The man had lived in Willow Bend for decades. He had the look of someone who had seen too much and learned to keep quiet about most of it. He approached the cowboy in a slow, steady way. "You picked up that old horse?" the rancher said in a calm voice. The cowboy gave a small nod. "Figured it needed a home? There's a story about that one," the rancher replied. The cowboy paused. "What kind of story?" The rancher hesitated before answering. "Not mine to tell, but I'd keep an eye on that horse. It's been through more than folks realize." The cowboy waited for more, but the rancher simply tipped his hat and walked away. The vague warning lingered in the cowboy's mind long after he returned to the shed. What kind of past could an old lame horse carry that would make a hardened rancher speak like that? He brushed the horse's coat, noticing marks along its side that didn't look like normal scrapes. They looked older, deeper, almost as if something had once tried to hold the horse back. As the day warmed, the horse began pacing gently around the yard, not out of restlessness, but out of nervous searching. The cowboy followed its movement, quietly observing. Whenever the horse paused, it always turned toward the same distant area, the one near the woods. There was a pull in that direction the cowboy could almost feel himself. Later that afternoon, he decided to walk the horse closer to the fence line, curious but cautious. The ground was uneven, so he moved slow, letting the horse decide the pace. When they reached the edge of the property, the horse stopped suddenly. Its ears twitched, and a low sound came from its throat, something between a whine and a call. The cowboy felt the hairs rise on the back of his neck. He followed the horse's gaze again and saw nothing but empty land, tall grass swaying lightly in the breeze, and the distant trees standing still. But the horse was seeing something else. The cowboy turned back, deciding not to push further for the day. He guided the horse home and stayed close for the rest of the evening. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had stepped into something far bigger than he understood. This wasn't just a broken-down horse needing shelter. There was a reason it reacted the way it did. A reason it had stared into the night as if expecting something to appear. During sundown, the cowboy watched the horse rest under the warm glow creeping through the open shed door. The peaceful moment didn't last long. A sharp noise echoed faintly from the far fields, not loud, but clear enough. The horse jerked its head up, eyes wide. The cowboy stood quickly, scanning the horizon. It wasn't a sound he recognized. Not the cry of an animal or the creak of wood. It was something metallic, distant, like a faint clatter against an old piece of farm equipment. But there were no farms out in that direction. The horse grew tense, shifting its weight, breathing deep and fast. The cowboy stepped closer, placing a firm hand against the horse's neck. He whispered again, steady voice, calming tone. The horse slowly eased but didn't fully settle. The cowboy kept his own fear buried deep. He didn't want the horse to sense any worry from him. That night, the cowboy sat on a wooden stool outside the shed, listening to the land. The moon hung low and pale, casting long shadows across the fields. The horse occasionally lifted its head, reacting to sounds too soft for the cowboy to hear. Every time it did, the cowboy felt a tightness in his chest. A memory stirred inside him. Years ago, before he drifted from town to town, he had seen the same look in another horse. A wild Mustang that had wandered onto a ranch he worked at for a short time. The Mustang had acted strangely for days, sensing something long before any person did. And then one morning, they found a section of old fencing destroyed, as if something had pushed through in a panic. The Mustang disappeared shortly after, never seen again. Folks said it must have run off, but the cowboy had always felt uneasy about it. Now, the same feeling returned. The next morning, he woke early to the sound of the horse pawing lightly at the dirt. It wasn't upset, but it was alert in a way that made him uneasy. He saddled up another ranch horse he borrowed from a neighbor, planning to ride out toward the land the lame horse kept staring at. He didn't plan to go far, just enough to understand what could be causing the strange behavior. But before he could leave, the lame horse pressed itself against the gate as if refusing to let him go alone. The cowboy hesitated. Bringing the horse along felt risky, but leaving it behind felt wrong. Something about the horse's insistence made him believe it needed to be there. He didn't ride out that morning after all. Instead, he stayed and studied the land from a distance. He noticed something subtle along the far fence line, a broken post leaning at an angle. It could have been from weather or age, but something about the break looked too sharp, too recent. The cowboy felt a slow chill crawl up his spine. He didn't know what the horse had found out there, but he knew one thing for certain. Whatever it wasn't done with them yet. The townsfolk kept a close eye on the cowboy over the next few days, and not just out of curiosity. Word had spread that the old horse he bought for $1 was acting strange. Folks whispered about how it kept pawing at the barn floor late at night, or how it would stare out toward the open fields as if waiting for something to return. No one wanted to say it straight, but everyone felt it, that uneasy tug under the ribs, the kind that makes a person pause before stepping out into the dark. The cowboy noticed it too. Every dawn the horse stood ready as if it expected him to follow. It nudged the gate, paced the fence line, and snorted toward the far edge of town where the land dipped low into a dry creek bed. It wasn't the behavior of a worn-out, lame animal. It felt purposeful, determined. The cowboy had spent his whole life around livestock, and he knew when a creature was trying to say something. But what bothered him most wasn't the horse's behavior, it was the feeling in his gut. A quiet signal. Almost like a warning. He tried to brush it off. Folks already thought he was the strange one. A man who spent more time on open land than around people. A man who kept to himself and never said more than he needed to. But the horse didn't let him ignore the signs. That very week, while the cowboy worked in the barn, the animal nudged an old feed bin so hard it toppled over. Buried under dust and rope was a small wooden box. The cowboy stared at it, his heartbeat picking up for the first time in years. He didn't open it right away. Something held him back, as if the air itself had tightened around the moment. He set the box aside and kept working. But the horse didn't let it go. Every time the cowboy walked past the box, the horse would look at it, then at him, with an insistence that made the skin on his neck prickle. The cowboy wasn't superstitious, never had been, but something about the animal's awareness made him uneasy. And he wasn't the only one sensing something deeper beneath the surface. That same week, a group of ranch hands stopped by his place under the excuse of checking the fence line. They didn't usually venture that far unless they needed something. They asked about the horse, pretending it was harmless conversation. But the cowboy could tell they were fishing for answers. One of them kept glancing at the barn like he expected someone or something to step out of the shadows. Their questions circled the same points. Where did the horse come from? Had it shown any odd behavior? Had he found anything unusual with it? The cowboy didn't offer much. Their interest felt wrong. Too sharp, too observant. When they finally rode off, he noticed one of them kept turning around, watching his property until the trees swallowed the road. It was the kind of behavior that didn't sit well. Days passed, and curiosity about that wooden box gnawed at him until he finally sat down alone in the barn and lifted the lid. Inside was a stack of folded papers and a metal tag with numbers worn thin by time. The papers looked old, their edges curled from years of neglect. The writing was faint, but he could make out enough of it to feel his stomach drop. His hands shook slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of what he was reading. It hinted at something hidden, something buried, something that someone had gone to great lengths to keep quiet. Before he could read further, the horse let out a sharp, restless sound and stamped the ground. Its whole body tightened with alarm. The cowboy stood and stepped outside, scanning the open fields. He didn't see anyone, but he felt eyes on him. Someone was out there, watching, waiting. The breeze carried a tension that was hard to shake. He shut the barn doors and stayed up the rest of the night, half expecting someone to come knocking. But the quiet held, at least for the moment. The next morning, the horse refused to eat. Instead, it walked to the gate, nudged the latch, and stared toward the distant ridge. The cowboy knew then that ignoring it wasn't an option anymore. Something out there was connected to this animal, something the horse wanted him to find. And judging by the odd behavior of the townsfolk, others already knew a piece of the truth. A piece he didn't yet understand. Still, he wasn't reckless. Before heading anywhere, he tucked the papers and metal tag away in his coat. If the horse was leading him into trouble, he at least wanted to know what he was dealing with. But as he saddled up, he noticed fresh tracks near his property. They were faint, like someone had been careful. Too careful. Whoever left them hadn't wanted to be seen. The cowboy felt a twinge of unease. The last thing he needed was someone tracking his movements while he tried to make sense of what the horse was revealing. He scanned the tree line again. Nothing moved. But he trusted his instincts more than his eyes. Something was unfolding around him. He could feel it tightening like a rope pulled from both ends. As he followed the horse toward the ridge, he passed by familiar land with an unfamiliar tension hanging over it. Every rustle felt louder. Every shadow held weight. The horse kept a steady pace, occasionally glancing back to be sure he was still behind. It wasn't wandering. It had a destination in mind. They reached the old creek bed just before noon. What he saw there made him pause. The ground had been disturbed recently, the soil still loose in patches. Someone had dug there. Not for water, for something else entirely. The horse approached the disturbed earth and lowered its head, breathing slowly, almost mournfully. The cowboy dismounted and crouched down, brushing the dirt aside with his gloved hand. He didn't dig far, but far enough to feel something hard beneath the surface. He froze, unsure if he should keep going. The horse pawed the ground beside him. A firm, insistent gesture. Before he could uncover what was buried, the distinct sound of hooves snapped his attention up. Someone was approaching fast. The cowboy stood, dusting off his hands, and positioned himself between the horse and the sound. Moments later, the same ranch hands from earlier rode into view. Their expressions were sharper now, less casual. One of them looked straight at the disturbed soil near his boots, and his jaw tightened. The cowboy didn't say a word. Neither did they at first. Then one of them spoke quietly, the kind of tone a person uses when they're trying not to let something slip. He asked why the cowboy was digging. Why he was following that horse around old land folks knew better than to wander into. Why he looked like he had found something he shouldn't have. The cowboy kept his face neutral, but inside, something began to shift. Pieces of the puzzle were starting to align, even if the full picture remained out of reach. These men weren't here by accident. And they weren't just curious. Their next question confirmed his suspicion. They asked if the horse had led him to anything yet. The way they said it made his chest tighten. They knew they had been waiting for this, maybe even dreading it. He didn't answer. Silence was safer. The men exchanged glances. Then one of them leaned forward slightly and said something that anchored itself deep in the cowboy's mind. Something that took the tension he already felt and twisted it into something far more pressing. He said the horse didn't belong to the cowboy. Not really, not anymore. And what the horse was guiding him toward wasn't meant to be found. Not by him. Not by anyone. Then they turned and rode off, leaving the cowboy standing in the creek bed with more questions than he could hold. The horse stood beside him, tense, waiting. Dust from the rider's departure settled slowly across the land. The cowboy swallowed against the dry air. The weight of what lay beneath his feet seemed heavier now, more dangerous, more urgent, but he wasn't ready to uncover it yet. Not with eyes on him, not with people expecting him to stop. He mounted the horse again, though his hands trembled slightly against the reins. Something told him that what the horse had found wasn't just a secret, it was a turning point. And the moment he dug deeper, his life would no longer be the quiet, solitary existence he knew. He headed back toward the barn, the horse keeping close as if sensing his uneasiness. Neither of them looked back at the disturbed soil, but both felt the pull of whatever was buried there. A pull strong enough to keep their thoughts tight and restless. And as the sun dipped low behind the hills, the cowboy realized something that sent a slow chill down his spine. Whatever lay hidden in that creek bed had scared the ranch hands. And if those hardened men were afraid, then he had every reason to be concerned. But fear wasn't going to stop him. Not now, not after everything the horse had shown him. And the truth, whatever it was waiting. The days that followed carried a pressure the cowboy could feel in his bones. Everywhere he went, the town seemed to watch him a little closer. Folks paused conversations when he walked by. Some nodded politely, but their eyes held questions they didn't dare ask out loud. The horse felt it too. It stayed nearer than usual, its steps light, its ears alert, as if expecting trouble to come riding out from behind every fence post. The cowboy tried to go about his work like nothing was wrong, but his mind drifted back to that creek bed each night. Even without seeing it, he could picture the dirt, the loose soil, the faint outline of something waiting beneath. He kept the wooden box close, studying the papers late into the evening while the single barn light flickered above him. The writing told a story he hadn't expected. It spoke of land disputes, missing livestock, and a small group of men who had tried to hide their tracks years back. The metal tag with faded numbers wasn't random either. It matched the marking of a horse from a ranch that had mysteriously shut down long ago. A ranch linked to the same men who had shown up asking questions. The deeper he looked, the more unsettling it became. And the more obvious it was that he wasn't the only one studying the past. One afternoon, while he was repairing the fence near the northern pasture, he heard the sound of hooves approaching again, but this time it wasn't a group. It was just one rider, a man from town who rarely left the main road. He wore a stiff expression, as if carrying a message he didn't want to deliver. He told the cowboy, in a quiet voice, that people were getting nervous, that old stories were making their way back into conversations, and that a few men were talking about heading out to the ridge that night. He didn't say why, but the cowboy already knew. They wanted to reach whatever was buried before he did. As the man rode away, the cowboy felt the weight of the moment settle over him. The horse nickered softly beside him, sensing his unease. He rested a hand on its neck and let the quiet sink in. The sun was dropping behind the hills, casting long shadows over the land. It was as if the whole valley held its breath. He couldn't wait any longer. As darkness approached, he saddled the horse and packed the wooden box in his coat. The air grew cold enough to sting his skin. Lights glimmered in distant homes, but the land between them felt wide, empty, and tense. He guided the horse toward the ridge, their path known to both of them now. The steady sound of hooves filled the silence. Every so often the horse stopped, lifting its head toward the wind. The cowboy felt the same strange urgency pulsing through him, the kind that told him his life was about to take a turn he couldn't undo. When they reached the creek bed, the moon cast a pale glow across the disturbed ground. The cowboy dismounted and knelt beside it again. The horse stood close, its breath warm in the cold night air. The cowboy removed his gloves and pressed his hand into the soil. It was even looser than before, like someone had dug there since his last visit. His chest tightened. Had the ranch hands come back? Had they already taken what was hidden? He dug faster, uncovering the top of a wooden lid. It was old, cracked, and stained by time. His pulse kicked hard as he brushed away the dirt. He reached for the edge, but before he could lift it, the horse jerked its head toward the trees. Its ears pinned back. The cowboy stood quickly, turning toward the sound. Branches snapped in the distance, voices followed. Quiet, but close enough to know they weren't alone. A group of riders emerged from the shadows, stopping just far enough to keep their intentions unclear. The cowboy recognized them immediately, the same ranch hands. Their expressions tightened as they spotted the unearthed box. One of them dismounted and stepped forward while the others stayed behind, their silhouettes stiff and watchful. The cowboy felt his pulse in his throat. He didn't want trouble, but trouble had found him anyway. The man who stepped forward spoke in a steady but strained tone. He said they were trying to protect the town, that some stories weren't meant to be stirred up again, that digging up the past could hurt people, and that sometimes letting the past stay buried was the only way to keep a community together. But the cowboy could hear something else under the man's words: fear, guilt, regret that had never found a place to settle. The cowboy told them he wasn't looking for a fight. He only wanted the truth. The man hesitated, then admitted that what lay inside that box might shine light on things folks didn't want exposed: mistakes, greed, choices that had spiraled into harm. The cowboy listened, but he didn't step away. Not when he'd come this far. The horse pawed the ground, drawing everyone's attention. It moved closer to the unearthed lid, lowering its head as if urging the cowboy to finish what he started. The riders stiffened, their hands inching toward their belts, not in threat but in panic. Another voice rose from the back of their group, a quieter voice. one that said the truth didn't belong to them anymore. The cowboy looked at the burial spot again. The surface of the box was now fully exposed. His fingers trembled as he reached for the lid. But before he lifted it, the wind shifted, carrying a new sound. The riders turned toward the valley below. Distant lights flickered in the direction of the road. More people were coming. Lanterns swayed in the hands of townsfolk making their way toward the ridge, drawn by rumors traveling faster than they could contain. By the time the lanterns reached the foothill, more figures stepped into view. Men, women, older folks who remembered the stories whispered years back. People who had known something was wrong back then but never had the proof to face it. The cowboy realized the creek bed was no longer a hidden place. It had become the center of everything. The ranch hands looked uneasy as the gathering grew. Their leader stepped back, shaking his head slightly as if the weight of the moment pressed down too hard. One of the older townsfolk stepped forward and said the horse had once belonged to a man who tried to expose wrongdoing years ago, but he never got the chance. That man had disappeared without explanation, and the horse had vanished too. Most thought it wandered off and died somewhere, but now it was clear that wasn't the truth. The horse had survived long enough to guide someone back to what had been hidden. The cowboy knelt again, feeling dozens of eyes on him. The lid creaked faintly as his fingers curled under the edge. For a moment, he hesitated. The world around him felt suspended, like everything was leaning toward this one moment. But he didn't open it yet, because something in the horse's stance told him this wasn't just about revealing what was inside. It was about facing whatever came after. Suddenly, one of the ranch hands stepped forward, his voice cracking as he shouted that opening that box would tear open wounds that the town had barely healed from. The tension in his voice spread through the crowd. People shifted uncomfortably. Some faces held fear, others held determination. The cowboy remained still, the lid inches from lifting. The night air tightened around them, the moon glowing like a lone witness above the trees. The horse lowered its head and nudged his shoulder gently. A gesture of trust. A gesture telling him he wasn't alone in this. The cowboy drew in a slow breath, raising his eyes to the people gathered around. Their faces were etched with years of unspoken truths, buried regret, and a hope that maybe this time the story would end differently. But before he could lift the lid, a loud crack echoed through the trees. A branch snapped. Then another. The riders turned sharply. The crowd quieted. The horse tensed. Something was moving through the darkness toward them. Something coming fast. The cowboy rose slowly, squinting into the shadows. The sound grew louder. Whatever was approaching wasn't trying to hide. It carried weight, determination, and a pace that made every heart in that valley tighten. The horse stepped in front of him, protective and steady. The crowd watched the darkness as the sound rushed closer, shaking the creek bed. The cowboy braced himself, unsure if what was coming would bring answers or danger. And as the figure finally broke through the trees, the night held its breath, and everything the cowboy thought he knew hung on the edge of the moment about to unfold. The figure that broke through the trees moved with an uneven stride, almost limping yet determined. The sound of branches scraping and snapping under its weight sent a ripple of tension through the crowd. The cowboy held the reins tight as the horse shifted protectively in front of him. For a moment, no one breathed. Lanterns flickered. The cold night air settled heavy across the creek bed. Then the figure stepped fully into the moonlight. It wasn't a threat at all. It was an older man with a worn coat draped over thin shoulders and a face carved by years of hardship. His gray hair was tangled from the wind, and his steps wavered slightly as he approached. The townsfolk murmured in confusion. A few gasped. The cowboy felt the horse tense in recognition before the truth sank in. The man was the original owner of the horse. The one everyone believed had disappeared long ago. He raised both hands slowly, as if afraid someone might mistake his arrival for something dangerous. His voice cracked as he called out for the crowd to give him a moment. And even though his voice was rough from time and distance, it carried a calm authority that settled everyone's nerves. The ranch hands looked like they had seen a ghost. In some ways they had. The cowboy stepped forward, still unsure. The older man looked at him with gratitude and something deeper. A weight lifted from his shoulders as he looked at the horse. The animal let out a low, soft sound, stepping toward him with a gentleness that spoke of history. The man touched the horse's muzzle as if he had found a lost part of himself. He then looked at the half-buried box. The fear in the ranch hands' faces shifted to resignation. They knew this moment was coming. The older man explained in a quiet voice how years ago he had discovered wrongdoings that threatened not only his ranch, but the entire community. He had tried to bring the truth forward, but some men in town wanted the matter silenced. They feared exposure. They feared losing land and standing in the community. In trying to protect themselves, they had turned against him. He survived because the horse had carried him away during the conflict, but he had been forced to leave everything behind. He stayed hidden for years, waiting for a sign that it was safe to return, but no sign came. At least, not until he heard rumors that his old horse had reappeared. Rumors that someone new had taken an interest in the past he left buried. The cowboy felt the weight of the moment settle in his chest. He understood then that the horse had not been wandering aimlessly when it arrived at the auction. It had been searching, waiting for someone with no ties to the old conflict. Someone the town couldn't accuse of choosing sides. Someone who might help uncover the truth fairly. The ranch hands stepped forward, shoulders heavy with regret. Their leader admitted they had played a part in covering the truth, but age had changed them. They weren't proud of what they did. They only feared the past would tear the town apart again. They asked the older man for forgiveness, not expecting to receive it. The cowboy could feel the tension easing, replaced with a quiet sadness that came from years of hidden guilt and regret. He knew the moment had come to finish what the horse had led him to. He knelt beside the wooden box and lifted the lid. Inside were documents, witness notes, old reports, and a ledger that proved everything the older man had tried to expose. The truth wasn't cruel or violent. It was simply a case of greed and choices made out of fear. Nothing in that box threatened the town now. What it offered was closure. One of the elders stepped forward and said it was time to put the past to rest properly, not in secrecy, not in shame, but in understanding. The townsfolk talked quietly among themselves, then agreed. They would hold a community meeting and share the truth openly, allowing the truth to heal rather than divide. The older man nodded, relieved. He wasn't seeking revenge. He only wanted the truth to finally belong to everyone. The cowboy watched as the horse leaned gently into the older man's hand. The bond between them needed no words. It was clear the older man wanted to reclaim his horse, but he paused as he looked at the cowboy. He thanked the cowboy for honoring a horse no one else believed in, for listening when others might have turned away, for walking straight into danger without knowing the story behind it. And then, to everyone's surprise, the older man said the horse had already chosen his place. He could sense the bond formed between the cowboy and the horse, and he didn't want to break it. The cowboy felt something shift inside him. Something warm. Something like belonging. The crowd began to drift back toward town, lanterns bobbing gently in the night air. The ranch hands apologized openly. The older man stayed close to the cowboy and the horse as they walked back together. Along the way, he told the cowboy stories from his past. Hard years, but good ones too. Stories that gave life to the mysteries the town had whispered about for so long. By the time they reached the cowboy's barn, the sky had begun to lighten with the first hint of dawn. The older man looked around at the quiet property and smiled. He said the land felt peaceful, honest, a place where a horse with a long memory could learn to rest again. The cowboy offered him a warm meal and a place to stay the night, but the older man shook his head. He said he needed to speak to his own kin in town and make things right. He promised he would return soon, though, not as a stranger, but as a friend. The cowboy watched him leave, the horse standing close as if guarding the moment. When the man disappeared into the distance, the cowboy exhaled a long breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. The next few days felt different, lighter. The townsfolk greeted him with genuine warmth now. The story of the buried truth spread through the valley, but not in anger. People talked about how one old horse had brought their town back together, how it had taken a stranger to finish a journey that had been waiting for years. The cowboy didn't seek attention, but he couldn't deny that being welcomed by folks who once doubted him felt good. One morning, the older man returned with several townspeople. They offered the cowboy official documents giving him shared rights to the land near the creek bed. They wanted the truth to be kept safe, and they trusted him to do that. He accepted quietly, humbled by the gesture. The horse grew stronger with each passing day. Its limp faded almost entirely. It followed the cowboy everywhere, not out of weakness but loyalty. Together they rode the hills, watched the sunrise from quiet ridges, and lived a life shaped by honesty and the quiet strength of forgiveness. The buried box was laid to rest again, this time with the whole town present, not in secrecy, not in fear, but in unity. They placed it inside a small stone marker near the creek bed. A reminder of lessons learned, a symbol of healing. The cowboy stood beside the horse as the final stone was set in place. The breeze carried the soft sounds of people talking and laughing. For the first time in a long while, the town felt whole. As the sun dipped low, casting warm gold across the land, the older man approached the cowboy. He said the horse had found him for a reason. It had chosen him to finish a story that had been left unfinished. And in doing so, it had given the whole town a new beginning. The cowboy smiled as he placed a hand on the horse's neck. The horse leaned into him with calm, unshakable trust. The older man nodded with quiet pride and said the words the cowboy hadn't expected to hear. He said the town was better now because of him. The cowboy tipped his hat, humbled. He didn't come looking for purpose, but somehow it had found him anyway. In the shape of an old horse no one wanted. In a story buried deep beneath the soil, in a community learning to rise again. As evening settled in, the cowboy and his horse rode toward the open fields. The sky glowed with the colors of peace, and the land, once heavy with secrets, felt light and warm. The story that started with a lonely cowboy and a lame horse had become something far greater, something hopeful, something whole. And the cowboy knew, as the horse carried him forward, that they were exactly where they were meant to be,